It was a Tuesday morning when Jake first heard the desperate cries coming from his backyard. The sound was unmistakable, high-pitched, panicked, and relentless. He set down his coffee mug and walked to the sliding glass door, peering out into the early spring sunshine. There, beneath his old oak tree, was a tiny bundle of black feathers struggling on the ground. A baby crow. Jake had lived in his modest suburban home in Portland, Oregon for 5 years, and he'd seen plenty of wildlife. Squirrels, raccoons, the occasional deer wandering through at dawn, but he'd never been this close to a crow, especially not a helpless baby one. The little bird was flapping its stubby wings frantically, unable to gain any altitude. Its beak opened and closed in silent distress. Looking up into the branches above, Jake could see a nest, but it was at least 30 feet high. There was no way this little guy was getting back up there on its own. And worse, Jake spotted movement in the bushes nearby. His neighbor's cat, Mrs. Henderson's orange tabby, was stalking closer with predatory focus. "Not today, buddy," Jake muttered, stepping outside. The moment he approached, the baby crow's cries intensified. It hopped backward awkwardly, clearly terrified of this giant human. Jake moved slowly, speaking in soft tones. "Hey there, little one. I'm not going to hurt you, just trying to help." He'd read somewhere that you should be careful handling wild birds, that sometimes the parents reject them if they smell human scent. But looking at the cat creeping closer, and the exposed, vulnerable creature before him, Jake knew he had to do something. Using an old towel, he gently scooped up the baby crow and brought it inside, away from immediate danger. The bird was surprisingly light, all feathers and fragile bones. Its eyes were bright and alert, studying Jake with what seemed like suspicious intelligence. Jake set up a cardboard box in his garage with some old rags for cushioning and placed a shallow dish of water nearby. He spent the next hour researching crow care online, learning that baby crows, called fledglings, often leave the nest before they can fully fly, and that their parents typically continue feeding them on the ground. But when Jake checked outside periodically throughout that first day, he never saw any adult crows. The baby was alone. Abandoned or orphaned, he couldn't be sure. By evening, he'd made a decision. He'd help this little crow until it could survive on its own. He called the bird Russell. He wasn't sure why. The name just seemed to fit. Those first few weeks were exhausting. Russell needed to be fed every few hours, and Jake quickly learned that crows are not quiet about their hunger. The bird would screech and call until Jake appeared with food. Moistened dog kibble, bits of hard-boiled egg, and mealworms he'd ordered online. Russell's beak would open impossibly wide, and he'd gulp down whatever Jake offered. As Russell grew stronger, his personality began to emerge. He was curious about everything, hopping around the garage and pecking at anything that caught his eye. He seemed to recognize Jake, his cries changing from panic to excited whenever Jake appeared. There was something almost dog-like about his enthusiasm. By the third week, Russell's flight feathers had developed enough that he could flutter short distances. Jake started leaving the garage door open during the day, allowing Russell to explore the backyard while remaining close enough to return for food and safety. The crow would hop along the fence line, investigate the flower beds, and perch on the lower branches of the oak tree. Jake found himself looking forward to these moments. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Russell gain confidence and independence. The bird would cock his head and study Jake with those intelligent black eyes, and Jake swore he could see thoughts forming behind them. Then came the morning that changed everything. Jake was getting ready for work, running late after hitting the snooze button one too many times. He grabbed his keys and briefcase, heading for the front door when he heard it. Russell's distinctive call from the backyard. It wasn't his usual greeting. This was different, urgent, insistent. "Not now, buddy," Jake called out, unlocking his car remotely. "I'm already late." But Russell's cries intensified. Jake hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. Something in that sound made him stop. He'd spent enough time with the crow to recognize different tones and meanings. This was important. Sighing, Jake dropped his briefcase and walked through the house to the back door. Russell was on the patio, hopping back and forth in an agitated pattern. When he saw Jake, the crow hopped toward him, then back toward the garden, then toward Jake again. "What is it?" Jake asked, feeling slightly ridiculous for talking to a bird as if it could answer. Russell hopped to the edge of the garden bed and pecked at something on the ground. Jake walked closer and stopped short. There, laid carefully on the concrete, was a dead mouse. It looked freshly killed, its body still intact, and positioned almost deliberately in the center of the patio. Jake's first thought was that Russell had simply found it and was showing off his discovery. Birds brought things to places all the time, right? But something about the way Russell was watching him, the expectant tilt of his head, made Jake pause. "Did you bring this for me?" Jake asked slowly. Russell let out a softer caw and hopped closer to the mouse, then looked back at Jake. A strange feeling crept over Jake, something between wonder and unease. He remembered reading that crows were intelligent, that they could recognize faces and even held grudges. But gift-giving, that seemed almost too human. Jake disposed of the mouse, thanked Russell awkwardly, and headed to work, putting the incident out of his mind. It was probably just coincidence, but 3 days later, it happened again. This time, Jake found a dead sparrow on his doormat when he came home from the office. Russell was perched on the fence nearby, watching intently as Jake discovered his gift. "Russell, buddy, you don't need to do this," Jake said, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The sparrow was small and delicate, its neck clearly broken. It had been placed with odd precision right in the center of the mat, where Jake couldn't miss it. Over the next 2 weeks, the deliveries continued. A large beetle, another mouse, a mole, half a frog. Each item was deposited somewhere Jake would definitely find it. The patio, the doormat, once even on the hood of his car. Jake started researching crow behavior more seriously. What he found both fascinated and disturbed him. Crows were known to bring gifts to humans who fed them, but the gifts were usually shiny objects, buttons, bits of glass, bottle caps, not dead animals, at least not typically in the frequency or deliberate manner Russell was displaying. Some articles mentioned that crows might share food with humans they bonded with, treating them like part of their family group. But Russell wasn't sharing these offerings. He was presenting them, waiting for Jake's reaction, like a cat bringing home its hunt. Except cats did it instinctively. Russell's behavior seemed more intentional. Jake's girlfriend, Monica, came over for dinner one evening and noticed the latest delivery. A dead grasshopper the size of Jake's thumb, carefully placed on the patio table. "That's the bird you rescued?" she asked, pointing to Russell, who was perched on the fence watching them eat through the window. "Yeah, that's Russell," Jake said, scraping the grasshopper into the trash with a paper towel. "And he brings you dead things?" "Apparently that's what I get for saving his life," Jake tried to joke, but Monica's expression remained serious. "That's actually kind of creepy, Jake. It's like he's obsessed with you or something." "He's just a bird," Jake said. But even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't entirely sure he believed them. That night, after Monica left, Jake sat on his back porch with a beer and watched Russell roosting in the oak tree. The crow's eyes glinted in the porch light, and Jake felt that same unsettling sensation he'd experienced when Russell first started bringing gifts. There was an intelligence there that seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked quietly. Russell shifted on his branch but didn't respond. Of course he didn't. He was a bird. The deliveries escalated. By the end of the month, Jake was finding dead animals almost daily. Mice, voles, more birds, insects, even a small snake. They appeared on his porch, his car, his doorstep, and once, disturbingly, on his bedroom windowsill. which meant Russell had somehow maneuvered a dead chipmunk onto a second-story ledge. Jake's neighbors started noticing. Mrs. Henderson mentioned seeing "that crow of yours" flying around with things in its beak. The mailman asked if Jake was aware there were dead animals accumulating near his mailbox. Even his co-worker David commented that Jake seemed distracted lately, constantly checking his phone for messages from his security camera, which he'd installed to monitor Russell's deliveries. The footage was revealing and disturbing in equal measure. Russell wasn't just stumbling upon these animals, he was hunting them. The camera captured him stalking prey with focused determination, killing with surprising efficiency for such a young crow, and then carefully transporting the bodies to Jake's property. Sometimes Russell would spend several minutes positioning the offering, moving it with his beak until it was centered just right. It was the intentionality that bothered Jake most. This wasn't instinct, this was deliberate. One Saturday morning, Jake decided to try an experiment. When Russell delivered a dead field mouse to the patio, Jake didn't dispose of it immediately. Instead, he sat in a lawn chair and waited. Russell landed nearby, hopping closer, watching Jake with those penetrating eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Jake asked. "What do you want?" Russell cocked his head, studying Jake. Then the crow hopped to the mouse, picked it up in his beak, and moved it closer to Jake's feet. The message was clear: "This is for you." Jake felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "I don't want dead animals, Russell. I appreciate the thought, I guess, but you need to stop." Russell let out a series of soft clicks and caws, sounds Jake had never heard him make before. They almost sounded like language, like the crow was trying to communicate something specific. Jake reached out slowly, and to his surprise, Russell hopped onto his extended hand. The crow's talons gripped gently, and for a moment they stayed like that, man and bird, connected by something Jake couldn't quite name. Russell leaned forward and very gently touched his beak to Jake's thumb, a gesture that seemed almost affectionate. Then Russell flew off, and Jake was left with a dead mouse and a growing sense that something profound and strange was happening. The nature of the gifts began to change. Instead of just random prey animals, Russell started bringing specific items: a dead rat, the large kind that infested the city's older buildings, a wasp, its stinger prominently displayed, a crow from another territory, its body marked by Russell's attack. These weren't just offerings anymore. They felt like messages. Jake's unease deepened when he realized the pattern. The rat appeared the day after Jake mentioned to a friend that he'd seen evidence of rodents in his crawl space. The wasp came after Jake had been stung while gardening. And the rival crow, that arrived after Jake had complained about another crow that had been dive-bombing him during his morning jogs. Russell was protecting him, or at least that's what it seemed like. Jake tested this theory. One evening, he deliberately spoke aloud about the stray dog that had been getting into his trash cans. "That dog is becoming a real problem," he said, standing in his backyard where Russell could hear. "Keeps making a mess, knocking everything over." The next morning, Jake found a dead squirrel on his porch. Not a dog, obviously, but perhaps the closest thing Russell could manage. The message seemed clear: "I'm trying to help." This was getting out of hand. Jake called a wildlife rehabilitation center and explained the situation, carefully leaving out the more unsettling details. The woman on the phone was cheerful and informative. "Crows are incredibly intelligent birds," she explained. "They form strong bonds with their rescuers. What you're experiencing is probably his way of showing gratitude and social bonding. In crow culture, sharing food is a major sign of trust and family connection." "But he's not sharing it," Jake said. "He's just delivering it and watching me." "Well, crows are also known to study human behavior. He might be trying to understand your reactions, learning what you like or don't like. It's actually a sign of high intelligence." "So what do I do?" "You could try encouraging him to forage for other items. Reward him when he brings non-animal gifts. Crows love positive reinforcement. Or if you want to discourage the behavior entirely, you'll need to stop reacting to his offerings. No attention means no reward. Jake tried both approaches. He started leaving out shiny objects, coins, bits of foil, colorful buttons, and praising Russell enthusiastically when the crow showed interest in them. For a few days, it seemed to work. Russell brought him a bottle cap, then a piece of blue glass worn smooth by water. But then the dead animals returned, more frequent than before. It was as if Russell was saying, "I know what you really need, and it's not bottle caps." Monica stopped coming over. "It's too weird, Jake," she said during their breakup conversation over the phone. "That bird is always watching, and the dead things everywhere. It's like living in a horror movie. I can't deal with it anymore." Jake wanted to argue, to tell her she was overreacting. But standing in his backyard with Russell perched above him, 3 dead mice arranged in a perfect triangle on the patio table, Jake couldn't really blame her. His life had become defined by the crow's obsession. Work suffered. Jake found himself distracted during meetings, wondering what Russell was doing, what he might be bringing home next. His boss noticed his declining performance. Friends stopped inviting him to gatherings after he'd spent an entire barbecue talking about crow intelligence and gift-giving behavior. Jake knew he should release Russell fully, stop feeding him, encourage him to join wild crow populations. But every time he considered it, he'd look into those intelligent eyes and see something that stopped him. Recognition, connection, maybe even need. And if Jake was being honest with himself, he needed Russell too. The crow had become his companion, his constant. In a life that had become increasingly isolated, Russell was the one consistent presence. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening in late July. Jake had just gotten home from a particularly grueling day at the office. His boss had criticized his recent work, and he'd gotten into an argument with a co-worker named Brad, an aggressive guy who'd been taking credit for Jake's ideas for months. Jake was venting aloud in his backyard, as he'd gotten into the habit of doing with Russell nearby. "Brad is such an asshole," Jake muttered, pacing the patio. "Always undermining me, always stealing my work. I swear if I could just make him disappear." He didn't mean it literally, of course, just the idle frustration of a bad day. Russell, perched on his usual spot on the fence, let out a series of loud caws that sounded almost like acknowledgement. Jake barely thought about the conversation again until Friday morning, when he arrived at work to find the office in chaos. Police cars were parked outside. People were clustered in worried groups, speaking in hushed tones. "Oh, what's going on?" Jake asked his co-worker, Sarah. "It's Brad," she said, her face pale. "He was attacked last night outside his apartment." Jake's blood ran cold. "Attacked? By who?" "They don't know. He said it came out of nowhere. Something black, diving at his face. Scratched him up pretty bad. He thinks it might have been a bird, but that sounds crazy, right? He's at the hospital getting a rabies shot just in case." Jake's mouth went dry. "A bird. I know it sounds insane, but he's got scratches all over his face and arms. Whatever it was, it really went after him." Jake spent the rest of the day in a daze. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Russell was just a crow. He brought dead animals, sure, but attacking a human. That was different. That was dangerous. But when Jake got home and found Russell waiting for him, preening innocently on the fence, he noticed something. Russell's talons looked scratched, slightly damaged, and there was a small cut on his beak that hadn't been there yesterday. "Russell," Jake said slowly, his heart pounding. "What did you do?" The crow tilted his head, blinking slowly. Then he flew down to the patio and deposited something at Jake's feet. A torn piece of fabric, navy blue, the same color as the shirt Brad had been wearing the day before. Jake staggered backward, his mind reeling. This was beyond gift-giving, beyond protection. Russell had listened to Jake's frustration and acted on it. The crow had hunted a human being. "No," Jake whispered. "No, no, no. Russell, you can't do this. Do you understand? You can't attack people." Russell cawed softly, almost questioningly, as if confused by Jake's distress. In the crow's worldview, he'd simply been protecting his flock, eliminating a threat. It was what crows did. But Jake wasn't a crow, and Brad, for all his faults, didn't deserve to be attacked. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Russell moving around on the roof above him. The gentle scratching of talons on shingles that had once been comforting now sounded ominous. He'd created this situation. By rescuing Russell, by bonding with him, by talking to him like a confidant, Jake had trained the crow to see him as flock, as family. And crows protected their family with fierce, sometimes violent loyalty. Jake had to make a choice. The next morning, he called the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center again, this time speaking with a different specialist, a man named Dr. Chen, who had 30 years of experience with corvids. Jake explained everything: the gifts, the increasing intensity, the attack on Brad. Dr. Chen listened without interruption, then was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Paulson," he finally said, "what you're describing is an extremely rare level of bonding. Crows are capable of complex social behaviors, but directed aggression towards specific humans based on perceived threats to their bonded human. That's remarkable and concerning." "What do I do?" Jake asked desperately. "The bird needs to be fully released and discouraged from returning. You need to stop all interaction immediately. No feeding, no talking to him, no acknowledgement whatsoever. Eventually he'll move on and integrate with wild populations." "And if he doesn't?" Another pause. "Then we may need to consider relocation or, in extreme cases, captivity. A crow this fixated could pose a danger to your community." Jake felt sick. The idea of Russell in a cage, or worse, being relocated far from the only home he'd known. It was unbearable, but so was the thought of Russell attacking someone else. That afternoon, Jake made the hardest decision of his life. He stopped feeding Russell. When the crow cawed for attention, Jake ignored him. When Russell brought gifts, a dead mouse, a beetle, a piece of shiny wire, Jake disposed of them without acknowledgement, without even looking at the bird. Russell's confusion was heartbreaking to witness. The crow would hop closer, caw more insistently, even land on Jake's shoulder like he used to. But Jake remained stone-faced, gently brushing him off, refusing to engage. For 3 days, this continued. Russell's cries became more desperate. He brought increasingly elaborate gifts: 5 dead mice arranged in a circle, a collection of colorful stones, even a $20 bill he must have found somewhere. But Jake maintained his resolve, his heart breaking with each ignored offering. On the 4th day, Russell brought something different. Jake found it on his doorstep when he left for work. A small bird's egg, unbroken and carefully positioned on a bed of soft grass. It was the kind of gift that required immense care to transport without breaking. The crow must have carried it for a considerable distance, moving with extreme caution. It wasn't a gift of death, it was a gift of life, of hope, of new beginnings. Jake stared at the egg for a long time, his vision blurring with unexpected tears. He picked up the egg carefully, cradling it in his palm. Russell was perched on the fence, watching with those impossibly intelligent eyes. The crow didn't caw or demand attention. He simply waited, as if knowing this moment required silence. Jake realized something in that instant. Russell wasn't just bringing dead things because of some predatory instinct or confused attempt at provision. The crow had been trying to communicate in the only language he knew, the language of survival, of sacrifice, of showing value through action. Every dead mouse, every fallen bird had been Russell's way of saying, "You matter to me, you're worth protecting, you're part of my flock." And now with this egg, Russell was offering something even more precious. Not death, but potential. Not endings, but beginnings. But Jake also understood that this bond, as profound as it was, had become dangerous. Russell's intelligence and loyalty had created a situation that neither of them could sustain. Love, even between species, sometimes meant letting go. Jake set the egg down gently on the porch railing. "Thank you, Russell," he said quietly, allowing himself this one moment of connection. "Thank you for everything, but you need to go now. You need to find your own kind, live your own life. I can't be what you need me to be." Russell cocked his head, and for a moment Jake could swear the crow understood every word. Then Russell flew to the egg, picked it up with extraordinary gentleness, and flew away into the morning sky. Jake watched him disappear beyond the trees, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. He told himself it was for the best. Russell would find a mate, join a murder of crows, live the life he was meant to live, and Jake would return to his normal existence, free from the strange burden of being a crow's chosen human. But over the following weeks, Jake found that normal felt emptier than he'd expected. He went through the motions of his life: work, home, sleep, repeat. He patched things up with Brad, who recovered from the mysterious bird attack with only minor scars and a newfound fear of anything with feathers. Jake even started dating again, meeting a woman named Claire who worked at the coffee shop near his office. But every morning, Jake found himself looking out into his backyard, hoping to catch a glimpse of black feathers in the oak tree. The yard felt abandoned now, too quiet without Russell's distinctive cause. Then, 6 weeks after Russell's departure, something changed. Jake woke to the sound of multiple crows calling in his backyard. Not just one voice, but many, a whole chorus. He rushed to the window and stopped, stunned by what he saw. At least a dozen crows were gathered in his yard, perched on the fence, in the tree, on his patio furniture. And there, in the center of them all, was Russell. Jake recognized him immediately. The slight irregularity in his left wing feathers, the particular tilt of his head. But Russell wasn't alone. Next to him perched another crow, slightly smaller with sleeker feathers, a mate. As Jake watched, Russell hopped forward and deposited something on the patio table. Not a dead animal this time. It was an acorn, perfect and whole. Then Russell's mate hopped forward and added her own gift, a small, smooth pebble. One by one, each crow in the gathering approached and left an offering. Acorns, pebbles, a bottle cap, a button, a piece of sea glass. Small treasures, carefully chosen. Not gifts of death, but tokens of something else entirely. Respect, acknowledgement, family. Jake opened the back door and stepped outside. The crows didn't flee. They watched him with calm intelligence as he approached the collection of gifts on his table. Russell let out a soft caw, and the other crows echoed it, a sound that was almost melodic. "You found your people," Jake said softly, looking at Russell. "I'm glad." Russell bobbed his head, then did something Jake had never seen him do before. The crow bowed, actually bowed, lowering his head and spreading his wings slightly in what seemed like a gesture of respect and farewell. Then, as if on some invisible signal, all the crows took flight together. They circled Jake's yard once, twice, 3 times, a swirling mass of black wings and calls, and then they were gone, disappearing into the morning sky. But Jake knew Russell wasn't really gone. Not entirely. Over the months that followed, Jake would occasionally spot Russell in the neighborhood, sometimes alone, sometimes with his mate, often with what Jake assumed were their offspring. Younger crows who followed Russell with the same devoted attention Russell had once shown Jake. Russell never approached Jake's house again, never brought more gifts. But sometimes, when Jake was walking through the neighborhood or sitting in his backyard, he'd hear a familiar caw. He'd look up and see Russell perched somewhere nearby, watching. Not with the intense fixation of before, but with something calmer, recognition, memory. And Jake would nod, a simple acknowledgement between two beings who had once shared something rare and strange and ultimately impossible to sustain. Jake learned things from Russell that he'd never expected a crow to teach him, about intelligence in forms we don't always recognize, about how love and loyalty can manifest in ways both beautiful and terrifying, about the responsibility that comes with connection and the courage it takes to let go of something precious for the right reasons. His co-workers noticed the change in him. Jake seemed more present, more engaged with the world around him. He started volunteering at the local wildlife rehabilitation center on weekends, helping injured birds and learning more about the complex inner lives of creatures most people barely noticed. Claire, his girlfriend, learned about Russell eventually. Jake showed her the box of gifts he'd kept, the smooth pebbles, the sea glass, the perfect acorn. He told her the whole story, expecting judgment or mockery. Instead, Claire was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "That's actually beautiful," she said. "Terrifying, sure, but beautiful. He chose you out of everyone in the world. That means something." And it did mean something. Jake carried that knowledge with him, that he'd been seen, truly seen, by another consciousness, that he'd mattered enough to a wild creature for that creature to change its entire nature in an attempt to connect. 1 year to the day after Jake first found Russell in his backyard, he was sitting on his porch with his morning coffee when something caught his eye. There, on the patio table, positioned with careful precision, was a single black feather. Jake picked it up, recognizing it immediately. It was one of Russell's primary flight feathers, shed during molting. Crows don't usually leave feathers as gifts. They're too valuable, too much a part of themselves. But this wasn't just a gift. It was a memory made tangible, a reminder that some connections, however brief or impossible, change us forever. Jake looked up into the oak tree and saw a familiar silhouette perched in the highest branches. Russell. The crow let out a single clear call, not demanding, not desperate, just a greeting between old friends. Jake raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. Russell bobbed his head once, then spread his wings and flew off into the morning light, joining a small group of crows that had been waiting for him in the distance. Jake tucked the feather into his shirt pocket, right over his heart, and smiled. He'd rescued a baby crow once, and in return, that crow had given him something precious. Not dead animals or shiny objects, but a glimpse into a kind of intelligence and emotion that most people would never experience. Sometimes the universe gives us teachers in unexpected forms. Sometimes those teachers come with feathers and sharp beaks and an intensity that borders on obsession. And sometimes, if we're lucky, those teachers remind us that connection, real, profound, transformative connection, can happen in the most unlikely ways. Jake finished his coffee, went inside, and got ready for work. But throughout that day and all the days that followed, he carried Russell's feather with him. A reminder of the baby crow in the backyard, the dead animals on the doorstep, and the strange, beautiful, terrifying gift of being chosen by something wild. In the end, Jake hadn't just rescued Russell. In ways he was still discovering, Russell had rescued him too.